0300 hours, December 3rd, 1944. Somewhere in the Rhineland, on a 500-foot escarpment called Lucherberg, the German garrison slept in their positions atop the height, confident in the steep cliffs that protected their western approaches. Where old strip mines had carved sheer walls into the earth, the terrain dropped away into darkness, a natural fortress of rock and frozen slag that seemed impassable. To the north, open ground stretched toward the American lines, but the Germans had fortified every meter with machine gun nests and trenches. No army would attempt either approach in the dead of night. The sentries peered into the blackness and saw nothing, heard nothing. The wind carried only the distant rumble of artillery somewhere to the north, a sound so constant it had become background noise. The Americans had stopped fighting hours ago, just as they always did when the sun went down. The German soldiers knew this pattern by heart. When darkness fell, the Americans rested. They ate their rations. They wrote letters home. They did not come. This had been true in Normandy. It had been true in the hedgerows. It had been true at the Siegfried Line. The night belonged to the Germans. It always had. Then the first grenade exploded inside a house on the rim of the cliff. American soldiers were already among them, having scaled the sheer western cliffs in total silence while the garrison slumbered. Within seconds, chaos erupted across the German positions. Men stumbled from their bunks into a nightmare of explosions, screaming, and the flash of bayonets in the dark. They could not see how many attackers had come. They could not tell which direction was safe. They only knew that the Americans, who never fought at night, who always paused when darkness fell, had somehow appeared inside their perimeter like ghosts. 6 hours later, when the fighting finally ceased, a radio message captured the scale of what had happened. "We have so many dead Germans in front of us that we cannot see to shoot." The initial assault had cost just 13 American casualties against more than 200 Germans killed or captured. By the time the battle for Lucherberg ended 2 days later, the division had suffered approximately 100 casualties while inflicting 4 times that number on the defenders. A captured German officer, pulled from the rubble of a shattered command post, could only shake his head in disbelief. "It is just plain unfair," he said, "to fight at night." The men who scaled those cliffs belonged to the 104th Infantry Division of the United States Army. They called themselves the Timberwolves. Their enemies would come to know them by a different reputation. The Americans who fought after dark. This is the story of what happened when American soldiers broke the unwritten rules of warfare and brought terror to German defenders in the hours after midnight. It is the story of how darkness, that ancient companion of fear, became a weapon more devastating than artillery. And it is told through the words of the German soldiers who faced it, men who thought they understood their enemy until the Americans stopped playing by the rules. The 104th Infantry Division was activated on September 15, 1942, at Camp Adair in Oregon. From its first days, the division was different from every other unit in the United States Army. Its commander, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, had already earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive and unconventional officers in the service. He had led the 1st Infantry Division through the brutal fighting in North Africa and Sicily, where he learned lessons that would shape everything he did with the Timberwolves. Allen had seen what happened when American soldiers attacked entrenched German positions in daylight. He had watched his men get cut down by artillery registered on every approach, by machine guns sighted to cover every meter of open ground. He had buried too many soldiers who died because the enemy knew exactly when and where they would come, and he had noticed something else. At night, the Germans relaxed. At night, the killing stopped. Both sides seemed to accept an unspoken agreement that darkness meant rest. Allen rejected that agreement entirely. He had seen too many men die in frontal assaults. He had watched companies get cut to pieces, crossing open ground under observed fire. He believed there was a better way to fight, and that better way was to attack when the enemy least expected it. He developed a training doctrine built around a single obsession: night attack. Find them, fix them, and fight them. Take the high ground, inflict maximum damage to the enemy with minimum casualties to ourselves. Night attack, night attack, night attack. He repeated these words until they became the heartbeat of the division. Every training exercise, every tactical discussion, every after-action review came back to these same principles. While other American divisions trained 8 to 12 hours per week in darkness, Allen required his Timberwolves to train 30 to 35 hours per week at night, 3 to 4 times the Army standard. His men learned to move through forests without making a sound. They practiced feeling their way through terrain that would be invisible in the blackness of a clouded night. They learned to communicate with hand signals, even when those hands could barely be seen. They learned to listen, to interpret the sounds of the darkness, to distinguish between the rustle of wind through trees and the movement of men through undergrowth. They practiced attacks using only bayonets and hand grenades, weapons that did not create muzzle flashes to reveal their positions. Every rifle shot in darkness gave away the shooter's location. Every tracer round drew a line straight back to its source. But a bayonet was silent. A grenade, once thrown, exploded without revealing who had thrown it. Allen's men drilled until they could assault enemy positions in total darkness, without a single shot fired until they were close enough to see the whites of German eyes. The training was brutal and exhausting. Men stumbled through obstacle courses they could not see. They navigated compass courses in terrain that looked completely different in darkness than in daylight. They practiced first aid in conditions where they could not see the wounds they were treating. They learned that darkness was not their enemy. Darkness was their weapon. General Omar Bradley, who would later command all American ground forces in Europe, assessed the results with characteristic bluntness. Allen brought the only division I know of that was prepared for night combat. The Timberwolves arrived in France in October of 1944 and went into action almost immediately. They would spend 195 consecutive days on the front lines, fighting their way through some of the most heavily defended terrain in Western Europe. And they would do much of that fighting in darkness, terrifying German defenders who had never faced anything like them. To understand why American night attacks shocked the Germans so completely, you must first understand what the Germans expected from their enemy. Shortly after the Normandy landings, German intelligence identified a critical pattern in American combat behavior. There was usually a lull in the fighting during the nights, German army reports observed. The Americans seldom continued a fight after the sun went down. This was not mere observation. It was a vulnerability the Germans exploited ruthlessly. Military historian Craig Chapman, a former United States Army infantry officer who spent years reviewing American unit journals from the war, confirmed what the Germans had discovered. "Only the Germans used the dark to launch attacks," he wrote. The Americans gave the night away. German forces, pressed during the day by American infantry and pulverized from above by Allied aircraft, felt a huge sense of relief when darkness fell. They knew they had hours of safety ahead, hours to reorganize shattered units and consolidate survivors from companies that had been torn apart during the day, hours to bring forward replacements from training depots in the rear, young men who would take the places of the dead and wounded, hours to carry ammunition and rations to the front lines using routes that would be swept by machine gun fire in daylight. They used darkness to dig new positions and reinforce old ones, to string wire and plant mines, to prepare the kill zones that would greet American attackers when the sun rose. They evacuated their wounded under cover of night, moving them to aid stations and hospitals without fear of strafing fighters. They conducted tactical movements in preparation for local counterattacks, repositioning tanks and assault guns to striking positions they would never reach in daylight. They moved into defensive positions without opposition, settled themselves, registered their weapons on likely avenues of approach, and waited for morning. German commanders came to depend on this nightly respite. Their defensive plans assumed it. Their troop rotations required it. The entire rhythm of combat in the European theatre was built around the understanding that when darkness fell, the fighting paused. American and German soldiers alike settled into their holes and waited for dawn. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt at the German High Command in the West, captured the prevailing view with a single phrase: "Night is no man's friend." But what he meant was that night belonged to the Germans. The Americans had ceded it to them. This failure to fight at night was rooted deep in American military doctrine. The official field manuals, specifically Field Manual 7-10 for the Infantry Rifle Company and Field Manual 100-5 for Field Service Regulations, treated night attacks as exceptional operations requiring extensive preparation. Commanders were told they needed detailed reconnaissance of enemy positions, reconnaissance that could not be conducted in the same darkness that would cover the attack. They needed special training for the troops, training that most divisions never received. They needed dedicated rehearsals on similar terrain, rehearsals that took time divisions in combat did not have. They needed complex movement control measures to prevent units from becoming lost or firing on each other in the confusion of a night battle. The doctrine emphasized the difficulties of night operations but seldom mentioned the potential benefits. It treated darkness as a complication to be managed, rather than an opportunity to be exploited. Combat commanders, already exhausted from planning and supervising daytime attacks, lacked the energy and time to add nighttime operations to their burden. They had enough challenges coordinating infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft in daylight. The thought of doing all that in darkness, with limited communications and no visibility, seemed overwhelming. A 1944 directive from European Theatre Headquarters reinforced this reluctance, recommending night operations only for special purposes. The message was clear. Night attacks were risky. Night attacks were difficult. Night attacks were not worth the trouble unless there was no other choice. The result was predictable. American infantry attacked when the sun was up and rested when the sun went down. They followed the doctrine. They avoided the risk. And the Germans, who faced this pattern day after day, week after week, month after month, came to depend upon it. They built their entire defensive strategy around the certainty that when darkness fell, they would have time to recover. On the other side of the lines, German soldiers settling into their positions for the night felt the tension drain from their bodies. They posted sentries, of course. They maintained some level of alertness. But they knew from hard experience that the Americans would not come until morning. They could sleep, they could eat, they could write letters home by candlelight in their bunkers. The night was theirs. This made the shock even greater when American soldiers suddenly appeared in their midst at 3 a.m, bayonets fixed and grenades in hand. The Germans understood the psychology of night combat better than most. After the war, a group of former German generals and general staff officers wrote a comprehensive study of night operations for the United States Army Historical Division. This document, originally published as Department of the Army Pamphlet 20-236, represents the collective professional judgment of senior officers who had experienced night fighting across multiple fronts. Their assessment of darkness as a psychological weapon was unambiguous. Darkness acts as a strong stimulus to the imagination and thus burdens the nervous system, they wrote. A feeling of insecurity, which might eventually lead to panic, may be the outcome. The German officers explained how perception itself warps in darkness. The sensitivity of eyes and ears differs between night and day, with the result that in darkness objects seem bigger and distances greater. The ears exaggerate sounds that would hardly be perceptible during the day. This perceptual distortion amplified the terror of night attacks. Defenders could not gauge enemy strength, direction, or distance. Every rustle in the darkness might be a single scout or an entire battalion. On the disproportionate psychological damage inflicted by night defeats, the German officers were explicit. A reverse or defeat suffered at night has a more lasting effect on the troops' morale than one suffered during the day. They noted that night attack created a fundamental asymmetry favoring the attacker. At night, even more so than by day, he who takes the initiative has the advantage. Complete surprise in darkness could produce, in their words, complete stoppage of every movement, disruption of the chain of command, and panic. These were not abstract theories. These were lessons written in blood on the Eastern Front, where Soviet commanders like General Vasily Chuikov deliberately adopted night fighting to negate German advantages in combined arms warfare. At Stalingrad, Chuikov claimed that Wehrmacht soldiers experienced panic fear of close combat and night combat. The Germans disputed this characterization, but they could not dispute the effectiveness of Soviet night operations in the rubble of that destroyed city. Yet somehow, the German officers who wrote this study admitted that their own pre-war doctrine had been inadequate. The reader of the pre-war German Army Operations Manual, they noted, upon reaching the chapter heading Night Combat, found that the subject was covered very succinctly and somewhat superficially. The contents failed to reveal the tremendous importance that night combat and night movements were to assume in modern warfare. If the Germans had underestimated night combat in their own doctrine, they had also underestimated the Americans who would eventually master it. November 22nd, 1944. The city of Eschweiler, deep inside Germany. The Timberwolves had been in combat for barely 3 weeks, but they had already established a pattern that terrified German defenders in their sector. At 0300 hours, 2 companies of the 415th Infantry launched a pre-dawn assault on the city. Engineers cleared mines and booby traps in complete darkness as the infantry pushed forward. The Germans had fortified the city extensively. They expected any American attack to come in daylight, preceded by massive artillery barrages and supported by tanks. They expected the kind of methodical assault they had faced 100 times before. Instead, American soldiers were inside the city before the Germans fully understood what was happening. Within 4 hours, the Timberwolves had reached the heart of Eschweiler. Within 5 hours, they had blazed through entirely. The wartime account recorded the German reaction. It was an incredible performance, moving through a staunchly defended German town and seizing it from a nonplussed enemy who had yet to learn how to deal with these Timberwolves who fought by night. Simultaneously, troops who had infiltrated into the city centre before dawn raised hell inside German lines at sunrise, while the main force attacked from outside. The defenders found themselves caught between 2 American forces, one already among them, and one crashing through their outer defences. After that single day of fighting, the city was in American hands. The prisoners brought in for interrogation were bewildered. They continuously asked about the automatic artillery the Americans had used. They had never experienced such speed and volume of coordinated nighttime fire. They believed the Americans must possess some form of automated weapons system. They could not comprehend that the devastation had been inflicted by ordinary infantry and artillery working in perfect coordination in the dark. The Timberwolves were just getting started. The battle at Lucherberg on December 2nd and 3rd became one of the most dramatic night operations of the entire war. The town sat atop a 500-foot height with steep cliffs on the western approach, where strip mines had carved sheer walls into the earth. German commanders considered this flank essentially unassailable. No army would attempt to scale those walls at night. Company 1 of the 3rd Battalion, 415th Infantry, led by Lieutenant John J. Olsen, did exactly what the Germans believed impossible. Moving in complete silence, the Americans scaled the western cliffs in pitch darkness, while the German garrison slept above them. They pried 3 houses from the rim of the height before they were finally discovered. When the Germans realized what had happened, they counterattacked furiously. The Americans found themselves surrounded and outnumbered in the heart of the enemy position. Lieutenant Olsen, his situation desperate, made a decision that would have been unthinkable in daylight. He radioed his own position and called artillery fire on himself. The shells crashed down around his men, but they crashed down on the German counterattack as well. 6 hours of brutal fighting followed. When it finally ended, the American forward observers surveyed the carnage. The bodies of German soldiers lay so thick in front of their positions that the defenders had difficulty finding clear fields of fire. The final tally for the initial assault showed only 13 American casualties against more than 200 Germans killed or captured. German counterattacks continued throughout the day, including 1 assault supported by 10 tanks. Sergeant George Burns engaged a Tiger tank with his bazooka from a range of just 20 feet, destroying it in a massive explosion that could be seen across the battlefield. Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, cabled his congratulations, but the German defenders needed no congratulations to understand what had happened. They had been defeated by men who came in the darkness, who climbed impossible cliffs while they slept, who appeared inside their positions like vengeful spirits. It was just plain unfair. The captured German lieutenant complained to fight at night. His protest revealed more than frustration. It revealed the psychological collapse that night defeat produced. The Germans had rules for war, expectations about how battles should be fought. The Timberwolves had shattered those expectations completely. On December 2nd, 1944, the same day as the Lucherberg assault, 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 415th Infantry, waded across the ice-cold Inde River an hour before midnight. They moved forward following what the division history called a terrifying artillery barrage. The shells crashed down so close to the advancing Americans that the margin for error was measured in yards. But the tactic worked. German defenders could not raise their heads to engage the attackers. The official record captured what happened next. Surprised Nazis, dazed by the heavy fire, were overrun in cellars and bayoneted and grenaded into submission. The Germans staged several rallies, attempting to push the Americans back into the river. Each rally failed. The Timberwolves held their bridgehead and expanded it throughout the night. General Collins later praised the operation in a formal assessment. In a series of brilliant night attacks, the 104th Division forced a crossing of the Inde, and in a few days had cleared its entire sector to the Ruhr River. I regard the operation as one of the finest single pieces of work accomplished by any unit of the 7th Corps since D-Day. At Eschweiler, the 414th Infantry attacked in gathering dusk, launching successive assaults hours apart. The division history records a striking moment from that battle. A German soldier, pinned by covering fire, finally looked up to stare straight into the smudged faces of 3 Timberwolves. The Americans had gotten close enough to touch him before he even knew they were there. A commander of an adjacent task force called it the best example of an infantry attack I ever have seen. Near Stolberg, on November 18th, the 1st Battalion, 414th Infantry, executed one of the division's most remarkable silent approaches. Moving as silently as ghosts, the battalion stole through this integral part of the Siegfried Line without a man being injured or a shot fired. Hill 287, which had withstood 3 previous major assaults by other divisions, fell to the Timberwolves in just 2 days. At Merken, the 1st Battalion, 415th Infantry, executed what the record describes as a perfectly planned and executed night attack. Progress reports tracked the systematic destruction of the German garrison hour by hour. We have 9 houses along the northeast edge of town. Company B holds 11 houses. 2/3 of the town is in our hands. Prisoner, total, 168. Streets littered with more than 200 enemy dead. The account concludes simply, a routed foe pulled out of Merken. The tactics that produced these results were deliberately designed for darkness. Soldiers attacked with bayonets and hand grenades rather than rifles to eliminate muzzle flashes that would reveal positions. Engineers cleared mines ahead of assault waves in total darkness using touch and probe rather than sight. Shifting artillery barrages followed attackers so closely that casualties from friendly fire were accepted as the price of keeping defenders pinned. General Terry Allen's fundamental belief was vindicated again and again. Proficiency in night fighting kept casualties low. Over 195 days of continuous combat, the Timberwolves captured 51,724 German prisoners while suffering approximately 6,000 casualties of their own. They cleared 8,000 square miles of enemy-held territory. The night attacks were the key. The 104th earned a reputation among German units as fighters who came after dark, a tactical threat the Germans had not encountered from other American divisions. The Timberwolves were not the only American unit to demonstrate the devastating potential of night operations. Several of the war's most dramatic river crossings occurred in darkness, and each produced documented German shock and confusion. On the night of March 22nd to 23rd, 1945, General George Patton's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim. What made this crossing extraordinary was what it lacked. There was no artillery preparation to announce the assault. No aerial bombardment to warn the defenders. No ground smoke screens to signal that something was coming. No airborne assistance to confuse the picture. The crossing was conducted in complete secrecy, the antithesis of what German defenders expected for a major river assault. The German generals defending the Rhine had studied the American way of war. They knew that a major river crossing would be preceded by days of bombing and artillery bombardment. They expected elaborate deception operations. They expected massed airborne drops. They had prepared their defenses accordingly, concentrating their remaining troops and artillery at the points where they expected the Americans to attempt their crossings. Patton gave them none of that. The 11th Infantry Regiment's assault boats rushed forward in a wild ride beginning at 2200 hours. Charles MacDonald's official United States Army history records that they did it silently. The boats moved through the darkness with muffled oars, the men holding their breath as they crossed the legendary barrier that had protected Germany from the west since Roman times. When the first boats touched the far bank, several surprised Germans quickly surrendered, but another nearby group fought back briefly. The Americans suffered only 20 casualties in the initial assault before overwhelming the defenders. The Germans did not notice the adjusted positions for several hours, and their hurried artillery attacks did not hit a single boat. The crossing had achieved complete surprise. German commanders learned that the Americans were across the Rhine not from their outposts, but from fragmentary radio intercepts and confused reports of firing on the eastern bank. By the time they organized a counterattack, it was too late. Within 48 hours, 4 American divisions had crossed the Rhine. 19,000 demoralized German troops were in captivity. The Great Barrier that Hitler had ordered held at all costs had been breached in a single night by troops who came in darkness without warning. Patton himself called General Omar Bradley near midnight. Unable to contain his triumph, "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we are across." He was deliberately trying to beat Field Marshal Montgomery's elaborately planned Operation Plunder to the Rhine. Montgomery had assembled the largest amphibious force since D-Day for his crossing, with thousands of aircraft, hundreds of artillery pieces, and 2 complete airborne divisions. Patton crossed with a few hundred assault boats in the middle of the night. He succeeded by a full day, and he never let Montgomery forget it. The River crossing in Operation Grenade on February 23, 1945, represented the largest concentration of American artillery fire to that point in the war. 2,000 guns hammered German positions for 45 minutes, beginning at 02:45 hours. One soldier from the 29th Division described it as a great destructive bludgeon which was hammering all life and resistance out of the East Bank. General William Simpson deliberately chose to attack before the river reached its lowest point, specifically to take the Germans by surprise. The 119th Infantry of the 30th Division sent a 25-man patrol across an hour before the barrage began. The 29th Division sent patrols 30 minutes before the barrage ended to stake positions for the engineers who would follow. Smoke screens were maintained for 33 consecutive hours to conceal the bridging operations. Within 2 weeks, the 9th Army had reached the Rhine. The D-Day airborne operations on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, represent the largest American night combat action of the entire war. More than 13,000 American paratroopers dropped into the darkness over Normandy in the hours before the beach landings. The documented German reactions reveal how darkness multiplied the paratroopers' psychological impact far beyond their actual numbers. The 82nd Airborne Division's 6,420 paratroopers began landing at 01:51 hours. The drop was scattered. High winds, anti-aircraft fire, and pilot error spread the paratroopers across hundreds of square miles of French countryside. Many men landed miles from their intended drop zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Some were killed in the air before they reached the ground. But those who survived organized quickly, forming ad hoc groups from whatever units they could find. Small parties of American paratroopers conducted raids across the Cotentin Peninsula in darkness. They cut telephone lines. They ambushed convoys. They seized crossroads. And everywhere they went, they created the impression of a massive airborne force descending on the German rear. The effect on German command was devastating. The very scattering that seemed like a disaster for the Americans became a psychological weapon against the Germans. Every German unit reported paratroopers. They seemed to be everywhere at once. At La Fière, the 91st Air Landing Division's commander, General Wilhelm Falley, was killed by paratroopers in the pre-dawn darkness while driving back to his headquarters from a war game. He became the first German general killed on D-Day, shot by men who had dropped from the sky in the middle of the night. Contemporary accounts record a critical observation. In the confusion and darkness, the Germans took these small raiding parties to be much larger forces. A handful of paratroopers holding a road junction seemed like a battalion. A squad cutting telephone lines seemed like a company. The German command structure could not distinguish between actual threats and phantom ones. By 03:30 hours, the 91st Division had lost communication with troops defending the La Fière Bridge. The entire German command in the drop zones was paralyzed at the most critical moment, precisely because the night operation created uncertainty about the scope and direction of the attack. Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division's 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment provides a German officer's perspective on this paralysis. Von Luck was a veteran of the Eastern Front, an experienced commander who knew how to fight against night attacks. When reports reached him of paratroopers landing, he immediately requested permission to counterattack with his regiment while the Americans were still disorganized from the drop. His request was denied. His division commander cited standing orders not to engage without High Command approval, but High Command could not be reached. The telephone lines had been cut. The radio networks were jammed with confused reports. The chain of command, which functioned smoothly in daylight, had broken down completely in the chaos of a night airborne assault. Hours were lost, hours the paratroopers used to consolidate positions, hours that could never be recovered. Von Luck later wrote that the command paralysis resulted directly from the confusion the night operation had created. The Germans had the troops to counterattack. They had the tanks and the artillery. What they lacked was the ability to coordinate their response, and that ability had been stripped from them by the darkness and the chaos. American Ranger battalions also conducted documented night operations that produced measurable psychological impact on German and Axis defenders. At Send Station in Tunisia in February of 1943, the 1st Ranger Battalion executed what their records describe as the first Ranger behind the lines night raid for the purpose of gaining information and terrorizing the enemy. The explicit goal of psychological terror was written into the operation order itself. The subsequent night march at Jebel El Ankh in March of 1943 demonstrated the tactical potential. The Rangers undertook a 12-mile night march through rugged terrain to reach the heights behind German positions. At dawn, they surprised the enemy from the rear, capturing 200 prisoners. These were troops who had previously repulsed multiple frontal attacks. The mass surrender of 200 men from a position that had held against conventional assault illustrates the psychological collapse that night envelopment could produce. German assessments of American fighting quality evolved dramatically over the course of the war. These evaluations provide essential context for understanding reactions to night combat. Statistical analysis by Colonel Trevor Dupuy found that on a man-for-man basis, German ground soldiers consistently inflicted casualties at about a 50% higher rate than they incurred from the opposing British and American troops under all circumstances. This was true whether attacking or defending, with or without numerical superiority. However, this advantage eroded sharply as the war progressed. By the time of the Ardennes counteroffensive in December of 1944, American soldiers had closed the gap considerably, and in night fighting specifically, the advantage sometimes reversed entirely. Units like the Timberwolves inflicted casualties at ratios that would have been impossible in daylight operations. The German officer corps held complex views of American soldiers. Before the war, the prevailing German assumption was that America was a money-hunting nation, too engrossed in the hunt of the dollar to produce a strong military force. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the Americans could only build proper refrigerators. These assumptions were shattered by combat experience. German officers from the First World War had observed American aggressiveness with grudging respect. A chief of staff for General von Einem wrote that he had found the American army the most honorable of all enemies. "You have also been the bravest of our enemies, and in fact the only ones who have attacked us seriously in this year's battles." Other German officers observed that the American infantryman was reckless to the point of foolishness, and that Americans acted more like wild men than soldiers. Corporal Friedrich Bertenrath of the 2nd Panzer Division, interviewed by historian Stephen Ambrose for his book Citizen Soldiers, offered a revealing comparison between fronts. "In Russia, I could imagine nothing but fighting to the last man," he said. "We knew that going into a prison camp in Russia meant you were dead. In Normandy, one always had in the back of his mind, well, if everything goes to hell, the Americans are human enough that the prospect of becoming their prisoner was attractive to some extent. This willingness to surrender to Americans rather than fight to the death was a critical factor in the success of night operations. German soldiers who might have resisted fanatically in daylight used darkness to slip away from their units and find American lines. The night attacks of the Timberwolves and other units capitalized on this psychology. Men who could not see their officers, who did not know which of their comrades still lived, who faced an enemy appearing suddenly in their midst, often concluded that surrender was the better choice. Major General Rudolf von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, provided perhaps the most revealing assessment of American tactical choices. Speaking of the Hurtgen Forest battles, he could not understand the reason for the strong American attacks in that terrain. The fighting in the wooded area denied the American troops the advantages offered them by their air and armored forces, the superiority of which had been decisive in all the battles waged before. Von Gersdorff called the fighting in the Hurtgen worse than anything he had seen on the Russian front, and compared it in intensity to the battles of attrition conducted during the last 2 years of World War I. What von Gersdorff did not fully appreciate was that units like the Timberwolves had found a different way to fight in such terrain. Where daylight operations in the forest produced grinding attrition, night attacks produced sudden collapses. The darkness that made the Hurtgen so terrible for conventional operations became an ally for soldiers trained to use it. The final months of the war saw night operations increasingly associated with German demoralization and mass surrender. The Ruhr pocket in March and April of 1945 illustrated how darkness amplified the sense of encirclement and hopelessness among German defenders. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Walter Model, was trapped in an industrial region that had once been the heart of German war production. Now the factories were bombed out, the railways were cut. Supplies had ceased, and American forces pressed in from all directions. The attack opening the pocket on March 25, 1945, opened before dawn and simply vaporized the German defenders. Historian Robert Citino documented the collapse. German soldiers responded to American loudspeaker calls, or simply made for the nearest American unit, white flag or handkerchief in hand. They did not wait for daylight. They did not seek permission from their officers. They simply walked toward the American lines, arms raised, grateful that the war was over for them. One captured German soldier asked the question that haunted so many of his comrades. "What is the point in this? I have a wife and children." The question contained its own answer. There was no point. The war was lost. Every German soldier knew it. The only question was whether to die in a futile last stand or to survive and see his family again. 317,000 German soldiers surrendered in the Ruhr pocket, exceeding the number captured at Stalingrad. It was the largest mass surrender of German troops in the entire war. Darkness facilitated this collapse. Soldiers who might have held their positions in daylight, watched by their officers and comrades, used the night to slip away. They found roads leading west. They located American units, willing to accept their surrender. They traded their weapons for the promise of prisoner of war camps, where they would be fed and sheltered while waiting for the war to end. Field Marshal Model, who had sworn he would never surrender, dissolved Army Group B on April 15th rather than order his men to die in a hopeless cause. 6 days later, he walked into a forest and shot himself. His soldiers had already made their choice. They had chosen to live. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded all German forces in the West during the final weeks, captured the futility of late war command with a metaphor that revealed his despair. Leading armies in 1945, he said, was like playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. The instrument of German military power was broken beyond repair. No amount of skill could coax the right notes from it. Joseph Goebbels, recording the Rhine crossings in his diary on March 24, 1945, acknowledged that the situation in the West had entered an extraordinarily critical, ostensibly almost deadly phase. Even the master propagandist could find no words to disguise the reality. Germany was collapsing, its armies were dissolving, and every night brought more surrenders, more desertions, and more men choosing captivity over death. Derek Zumbro's doctoral research, based on extensive interviews with German soldiers and civilians from the final campaign, documented that people hoping to find refuge within American-held territory certainly substantiate claims that of the foreign armies cutting deep into Germany in the spring of 1945, the Americans remained the least feared. This willingness to surrender to Americans rather than fight to the death made night operations particularly effective. The combination of overwhelming force and the cover of darkness made surrender seem not just acceptable but sensible. The documentary potential of this story lies in its central irony. The United States Army possessed a tactical weapon, night attack, that its own doctrine effectively prohibited from routine use. German officers, writing after the war for their former enemies, explicitly stated that night combat broke morale faster than daylight fighting, that the attacker at night held an inherent advantage, and that surprise in darkness could produce panic and total collapse. Yet only one American division, the 104th, was systematically trained to exploit this advantage. The results speak through the German reactions themselves. Sleeping garrisons overrun, defenders bayoneted in cellars, prisoners bewildered by what they believed must be automatic artillery. A reputation for fighting after dark that no other American unit possessed, and a captured officer's bitter protest that fighting at night was just plain unfair. The question that haunts this history is simple. How many American lives might have been saved if other divisions had received the same training? How many grinding daylight assaults through defended terrain might have been replaced by swift night operations that caught the enemy unprepared? General Terry Allen believed he knew the answer. Proficiency in night fighting kept casualties low. His division proved it across months of continuous combat against a skilled and determined enemy. The record spoke for itself. More prisoners captured than any comparable unit, more territory cleared, more German positions taken with fewer American lives lost. All of it vindicated his relentless emphasis on night training. The German generals who wrote the post-war study on night combat recommended that up to 50% of all military training be conducted at night, starting from the first day of basic training. Their ideal night fighter was described as a self-reliant, fully integrated soldier commanded by a cool, resourceful, and thoughtful leader who inspires confidence and determination. They understood what darkness could do, because they had seen it used against their own men with devastating effect. Today, the Timberwolves are remembered as one of the most effective divisions of the Second World War. Their tactics have been studied by military historians seeking to understand what made them different from other units that faced the same enemy in the same terrain. The answer lies in those pre-dawn hours when American soldiers climbed impossible cliffs, waded ice-cold rivers, and appeared inside German positions like ghosts. It lies in the words of the German soldiers who faced them, the Americans who fought after dark. Just plain unfair. How do you fight men who come in the night? The Americans who fought at Lucherberg and Eschweiler and the Inde River crossing did not seek glory. They sought to complete their mission with the fewest possible casualties. They sought to come home alive. The darkness gave them that chance. It made them invisible until they were close enough to use their bayonets. It multiplied every small noise into a terror for the defenders. It transformed ordinary infantry soldiers into something their enemies had never faced. 768 men died when the battleship Mutsu exploded in Hiroshima Bay, victims of an accident that perhaps could have been prevented. The men who died in the night battles of Western Europe were also victims of decisions made far from the front lines. But they were decisions about doctrine and training, about what American soldiers would and would not be taught to do. The Germans understood that night combat favored the attacker. The Americans, for the most part, chose not to exploit that advantage. The 104th Infantry Division was the exception. Their story deserves to be remembered, not because war itself deserves glorification, but because their experience reveals a truth about combat that remains valid today. Darkness is a weapon. Fear of the unknown is a vulnerability. The side that learns to operate in conditions the enemy considers impossible holds an advantage that no amount of firepower can match. The German soldier who protested that fighting at night was unfair spoke a deeper truth than he perhaps understood. War has never been fair. The side that recognizes this, that trains its soldiers to exploit every advantage, that refuses to cede any terrain or any hour of the day to the enemy, is the side that prevails. The Timberwolves understood this. Their enemies learned it in the hardest possible way, awakened from sleep by the crash of grenades, overwhelmed in darkness by men they never saw coming. Night is no man's friend, General Blumentritt had said. The Timberwolves proved him wrong. For the soldiers who learned to fight after sunset, darkness became the best friend they had.